Sarah Johnson's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., the same time it had for the past 3 years, and she rolled out of her small bed in the cramped studio apartment in East LA, her body aching from yesterday's work but her mind already focused on the day ahead. She dressed quickly in her simple uniform, grabbed the bus pass that represented her lifeline to the wealthy neighborhood of Beverly Hills, and stepped into the pre-dawn darkness that still covered the city like a blanket of broken dreams. The bus ride took 45 minutes through neighborhoods that gradually transformed from broken streetlights and barred windows to manicured lawns and security gates. A journey that felt like traveling between two different worlds, and Sarah had learned to make herself invisible during this transition, knowing that her presence made some passengers uncomfortable. At exactly 7:15 a.m., she walked through the service entrance of the Wellington Mansion, a sprawling estate that could house 20 families like hers, and began her routine of cleaning, organizing, and maintaining a life of luxury she would never know. Marcus Wellington rarely acknowledged her presence, treating her more like a piece of furniture than a human being, his cold blue eyes never quite meeting hers when he gave instructions about dinner parties or business meetings. And his wife, Victoria, was even worse, speaking about Sarah in third person even when she was standing right there. But then there was Emma, the 8-year-old daughter with bright, curious eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest room, who always ran to hug Sarah when she arrived, chattering excitedly about school, friends, and the book she was reading. Emma was the reason Sarah endured the long bus rides, the dismissive looks, and the exhaustion that settled into her bones, because this little girl saw her as a person, not just as help. And their bond had grown stronger each day, as Sarah watched Emma grow from a lonely 5-year-old into a vibrant child who trusted her completely. While Marcus buried himself in business deals and Victoria traveled to fashion shows and charity galas, Sarah was the one who bandaged Emma's scraped knees, helped with homework, listened to stories about playground drama, and tucked her in when nightmares struck. She had her own children back in Detroit, twin boys who lived with her aging mother, while Sarah sent every spare dollar home to pay for their school supplies and her mother's diabetes medication, and sometimes the guilt of being away from them ate at her like acid. But she knew this sacrifice was necessary for their future. The Wellington house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, with its floor-to-ceiling windows, imported marble floors, and artwork that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But Sarah had learned that money couldn't buy the warmth that was missing from these walls. She moved through the house like a ghost, dusting priceless sculptures, polishing surfaces that gleamed like mirrors, and maintaining the illusion of perfection that the Wellingtons presented to the world, all while being treated as if she didn't exist. Marcus's study was filled with awards, photos with politicians and celebrities, and a collection of car magazines featuring his prized possessions, especially the red Ferrari that sat in the garage like a sleeping beast, waxed and polished but rarely driven, more of a trophy than a vehicle. Sarah had overheard enough phone conversations to know that Marcus's business empire was built on real estate investments and tech startups, that he worked 18-hour days and missed most of Emma's school events, and that he seemed to view his family as another acquisition rather than people to love and cherish. Victoria was no better, constantly jetting off to New York, Paris, or Milan for fashion weeks and social events, leaving Emma with a parade of nannies who rarely lasted more than a few months, until Sarah became the constant presence in the child's life. Today started like any other Tuesday, with Sarah preparing Emma's breakfast while the little girl chatted about her upcoming science project, her words tumbling over each other with excitement as she explained her plan to build a volcano that would erupt with colorful foam. Marcus sat at the kitchen island, reading financial reports on his tablet, occasionally grunting responses to Emma's questions, but never really listening. His mind, clearly focused on deals and profits, rather than his daughter's enthusiasm, had left the night before for a week-long trip to London, kissing the air near Emma's cheek and reminding Sarah to make sure the child's asthma inhaler was always within reach, the only sign that she cared about her daughter's well-being. Emma's asthma had been a concern since she was a toddler, with attacks that could come suddenly and escalate quickly, and Sarah had learned to recognize the warning signs, the slight wheeze in her breathing, the way she would slow down during play, the anxious look that crossed her small face when she felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Marcus left for his office downtown shortly after 8, barely acknowledging either Sarah or Emma, his expensive suit and confident stride carrying him toward another day of building his empire, while leaving the real work of raising his daughter to someone he paid minimum wage. The morning passed peacefully, with Sarah helping Emma get ready for school, making sure her backpack was packed with homework and her inhaler was safely tucked in the side pocket where she could easily reach it, and then watching from the window as the school bus picked up the most important person in this cold, beautiful house. But as Sarah began her daily routine of cleaning, organizing, and maintaining the Wellington's perfect world, she had no idea that by evening, everything would change, and the invisible woman who moved through their lives like a shadow would be forced to make a choice that would either save a precious life or destroy her own future forever. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the Wellington mansion's pristine living room when Sarah heard the front door slam with unusual force, followed by Emma's voice calling out in a tone that immediately made her stomach clench with worry. She dropped the crystal vase she was cleaning and rushed toward the entrance hall, finding Emma collapsed against the marble floor, her small chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath, her face already showing the pale, frightened expression that Sarah had learned to fear more than anything else in the world. Emma's backpack lay scattered beside her, books and papers spilled across the expensive Italian tiles. But Sarah's attention was focused entirely on the child's labored breathing and the way her fingers were clawing at her throat as if trying to pull air into her lungs by force. Sarah knelt beside Emma and immediately reached for the inhaler that should have been in the side pocket of her backpack, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with this crisis before. But when her fingers found nothing but empty space, panic shot through her like electricity. She frantically searched through the scattered contents of the backpack, tossing aside homework assignments and art supplies, her heart pounding as she realized the inhaler wasn't there. And when she looked into Emma's terrified eyes, she saw the same realization reflected back at her. Emma tried to speak, but could only manage a whispered Sarah before another wave of breathlessness hit her. And Sarah scooped the child into her arms, carrying her to the living room couch while her mind raced through emergency protocols she had memorized but prayed she would never need to use. She grabbed her phone from her pocket with shaking hands and dialed 911. Her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins as she explained the situation to the dispatcher, giving the address and describing Emma's symptoms while watching the little girl's lips begin to take on a bluish tinge that made Sarah's blood run cold. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional as she assured Sarah that an ambulance was being dispatched immediately. But then came the words that shattered Sarah's composure completely. "Ma'am, I need to inform you that due to a accident on the 405 freeway, all our units in your area are delayed, and the estimated arrival time is 45 minutes to an hour." Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis as she stared at Emma, whose breathing was becoming more and more shallow, her small body working harder and harder just to get oxygen. And she knew with absolute certainty that 45 minutes might as well be forever. She tried calling Marcus's office, her fingers fumbling with the phone as Emma's condition worsened before her eyes. But his secretary informed her that Mr. Wellington was in an important board meeting and couldn't be disturbed. And when Sarah explained it was a medical emergency involving his daughter, the woman promised to get the message to him as quickly as possible, but offered no timeline for his response. Victoria was somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, unreachable and unaware that her daughter was fighting for every breath. And Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she was completely alone in this nightmare, the only person standing between Emma and a tragedy that could unfold in minutes rather than hours. She tried every breathing technique she had learned from previous episodes, helping Emma sit upright and encouraging her to take slow, controlled breaths, but nothing was working, and the child's panic was making everything worse. As her body fought against the tightening airways that were slowly choking off her life, Sarah's mind raced through alternatives, remembering that there was a backup inhaler somewhere in the house. And she left Emma on the couch for 30 seconds to sprint upstairs to the master bedroom, tearing through drawers and medicine cabinets with desperate efficiency. But the backup inhaler was expired by 2 years, its medication potentially useless or even dangerous. When she returned to Emma, the child was slumped against the couch cushions, her skin now definitely blue around the lips, and her eyes were starting to look glassy and unfocused. Signs that made Sarah's professional instincts scream that time was running out faster than she had imagined possible. She called 911 again, pleading with a different dispatcher to expedite the ambulance, explaining that the child was deteriorating rapidly, but received the same response about delays and cliff, and she hung up the phone knowing that the system had failed them when they needed it most. Emma whispered, "I can't breathe." Sarah, in a voice so small and frightened that it broke Sarah's heart into pieces, and she gathered the child in her arms, feeling the rapid, irregular heartbeat against her chest, and knowing that she had to make a decision that would either save Emma's life or destroy her own. Through the living room's floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the garage where Marcus's collection of cars sat waiting, including the red Ferrari that he treasured more than anything else in his life, the keys to which hung on a hook in the kitchen where she had seen them every day for 3 years but never dared to touch. Sarah's mind calculated distances and driving times, knowing that Children's Hospital was only 15 minutes away in normal traffic, maybe 8 or 9 minutes if someone was willing to drive fast and take risks. And she looked down at Emma's face, seeing the trust and love in those dimming eyes, and realized that there was really no choice at all. She carried Emma to the kitchen, moving as quickly as she dared, and stared at the Ferrari keys hanging innocently on their gold hook, knowing that taking them would cross a line she could never uncross, that she would be branded a thief and probably sent to prison, that her own children would grow up knowing their mother was a criminal. But Emma's breathing was getting weaker with each passing second, her small body going limp in Sarah's arms. And when the child whispered, "Please help me," in a voice that was barely audible, Sarah reached up and grabbed the keys with a hand that was steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. She had never driven a Ferrari, had barely driven anything more expensive than her 15-year-old Honda. But she carried Emma to the garage and managed to figure out how to open the sleek red machine that represented more money than she would make in 5 years, carefully placing the unconscious child in the passenger seat and buckling her in with trembling fingers. The engine roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder, and as Sarah backed out of the garage, she saw the security system's red light blinking on the dashboard, knowing that somewhere an alarm was being triggered, that Marcus would be notified immediately that his prized possession was being stolen. But none of that mattered, because Emma's lips were now completely blue, and her breathing was so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Sarah pressed her foot to the accelerator and shot down the long driveway toward the gates that opened automatically, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. And as she turned onto the main road, heading toward the hospital, she whispered a prayer that she would be in time to save the most precious thing in her world, even if it meant sacrificing everything else she had ever worked for. Sarah's hands trembled on the Ferrari's leather steering wheel as she navigated through Beverly Hills traffic, the powerful engine responding to every slight pressure of her foot with a surge of speed that both thrilled and terrified her, while Emma lay unconscious in the passenger seat, her breathing so shallow that Sarah had to keep glancing over to make sure her chest was still rising and falling. The GPS system showed 14 minutes to Children's Hospital, but that was calculated for normal driving speeds, and Sarah knew she couldn't afford to drive normally when every second could mean the difference between life and death for the little girl who had become the most important person in her world. She pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the Ferrari leap forward like a caged animal finally set free, weaving between slower cars with a precision she didn't know she possessed. Her entire focus narrowed down to the road ahead and the precious cargo beside her. The radio crackled to life with an emergency alert about a stolen red Ferrari, and Sarah's heart sank as she realized that Marcus had already been notified by the security system that somewhere police cars were being dispatched with her license, plate number and description. But she couldn't let fear slow her down when Emma's life hung in the balance. Traffic began to thicken as she approached the intersection of Wilshire Boulevard, and Sarah could see a line of cars stretching ahead like a wall of metal and glass. But she spotted a narrow gap between 2 lanes and gunned the engine, the Ferrari, sliding through the space with inches to spare, while horns blared round her like an angry symphony. Emma stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open for a moment, and she whispered Sarah in such a weak voice that it was barely audible over the engine noise. But it was enough to give Sarah hope that she wasn't too late, that this desperate gamble might actually work if she could just keep the child alive for a few more minutes. She reached over to take Emma's hand, feeling how cold and clammy it was, and squeezed gently while keeping her eyes on the road, whispering, "Hold on, baby, we're almost there, just hold on for me," as she navigated around a city bus that was blocking 2 lanes. The Ferrari's dashboard lit up with warning lights as Sarah pushed the engine harder than it was meant to be driven in city traffic. But she ignored every signal except the GPS countdown that showed 9 minutes remaining, and she took a sharp right turn onto Olympic Boulevard with the tires squealing against the asphalt. Behind her, she could hear the distant wail of police sirens getting closer, and when she checked the rearview mirror, she saw 2 squad cars weaving through traffic about 6 blocks back, their red and blue lights flashing like deadly fireworks against the afternoon sky. Sarah's mouth went dry as she realized that she was now officially a fugitive, that even if she saved Emma's life, she would probably spend years in prison for grand theft auto. But when she looked at the child's pale face and blue lips, she knew she would make the same choice again without hesitation. The police sirens were getting louder, and Sarah could see in her side mirror that the officers were gaining ground. Their cars equipped with sirens and lights that allowed them to cut through traffic more efficiently than her stolen Ferrari. But she also knew that stopping now would mean Emma's death. So she pressed the accelerator to the floor and felt the car respond with a burst of speed that left the pursuing officers temporarily behind. Emma's breathing became even more labored, and Sarah could hear a horrible rattling sound coming from the child's lungs that made her blood run cold. Because she knew, from her experience with Emma's previous attacks, that this sound meant they were running out of time faster than she had hoped. She took another dangerous turn, this time onto La Brie Avenue. The Ferrari's sophisticated suspension system, keeping the car stable even as she pushed it beyond reasonable limits. And she could see the hospital sign in the distance, like a beacon of hope cutting through her desperation. The police were still following, but Sarah noticed that they seemed to be maintaining their distance rather than trying to force her to stop. And she wondered if someone had told them that she had a sick child in the car, that this wasn't a typical car theft but something far more complex and urgent. Traffic was lighter on this stretch of road, and Sarah was able to push the Ferrari up to speeds that would have been reckless under any other circumstances. The speedometer needle climbing past numbers she had never imagined driving, while Emma's hand grew colder in hers, and the child's breathing became so faint that Sarah had to strain to hear it over the engine noise. She could see the hospital now, its modern glass and steel structure rising ahead of her, like a temple of healing. And she knew that somewhere inside that building were doctors and nurses who could save Emma's life if she could just get there in time. But the final traffic light before the hospital entrance turned red just as she approached, forcing her to make a split-second decision that could determine Emma's fate. Sarah looked both ways, saw that cross-traffic was light, and gunned the Ferrari straight through the red light, hearing brakes squeal and horns honk as other drivers swerved to avoid her. But she made it across the intersection safely and pulled into the hospital's emergency entrance, with the police cars still following close behind. She slammed on the brakes and threw the Ferrari into park right in front of the emergency room doors, not caring that she was blocking the ambulance bay, and she jumped out of the car with Emma in her arms, running toward the automatic doors that seemed to open in slow motion. The emergency room staff took one look at Emma's condition and immediately sprang into action, with a nurse taking the child from Sarah's arms and placing her on a gurney while shouting medical terms that Sarah barely understood, and within seconds, Emma was being wheeled toward treatment rooms where machines and medications could do what Sarah's desperate love alone could not. Sarah collapsed into a plastic chair in the waiting room, her legs finally giving out after carrying her through the most terrifying 20 minutes of her life. And she watched through the glass doors as police officers surrounded the red Ferrari, their faces grim as they prepared to arrest the woman who had just committed one of the most public crimes in Beverly Hills history. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus's office, saying that he was on his way to the hospital. And Sarah realized that in a few minutes she would have to face the man whose car she had stolen, whose trust she had violated, whose daughter she had just risked everything to save, and she had no idea whether he would see her as a hero or a criminal. But she knew that whatever happened next, she had done the only thing that mattered when a child's life was on the line. Sarah sat in the hard plastic chair outside the emergency room, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline of the desperate drive, while two police officers stood nearby discussing her fate in low voices, their handcuffs glinting under the harsh hospital lights as they waited for orders on how to proceed with the woman who had led them on a high-speed chase through half of Los Angeles. The automatic doors of the hospital slid open with a mechanical whisper, and Marcus Wellington strode through them like a man possessed, his expensive suit wrinkled from running, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his face a mask of fury and panic that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. His eyes scanned the waiting room until they locked onto her, and she saw something in his expression that was beyond anger, beyond rage, something primitive and dangerous that made her understand why he had built an empire from nothing but determination and ruthlessness. Marcus marched toward her with purposeful strides, his hands clenched into fists, and Sarah braced herself for the explosion of wrath she knew was coming. But before he could reach her, one of the police officers stepped forward and said, "Mr. Wellington, we need to speak with you about the theft of your vehicle and the circumstances surrounding this incident." Marcus barely glanced at the officer, his attention focused entirely on Sarah as he stopped just inches from her chair, his voice low and controlled, but vibrating with barely contained emotion as he said, Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand that you've destroyed your life for nothing more than a moment of panic? Sarah looked up at him, seeing the man who had never truly seen her as a human being, who had treated her like furniture for 3 years. And she found her voice, despite the terror that was making her heart race like a trapped bird. Emma couldn't breathe, she said simply, her words cutting through his anger like a knife through silk. The ambulance was delayed 45 minutes, and she was dying right in front of me. So I did what any decent person would do. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, confusion flickering across his features as he processed her words. But before he could respond, a doctor in green scrubs approached them, clipboard in hand, and a grave expression on her face that made everyone in the waiting area hold their breath. "Are you Emma Wellington's father?" the doctor asked, and when Marcus nodded, she continued. "Your daughter is stable now, but I need you to understand how serious this situation was. She experienced one of the most severe asthma attacks I've seen in my 15 years of emergency medicine, and her oxygen levels had dropped to dangerously low levels by the time she arrived here." The doctor paused, looking directly at Sarah before continuing. "The woman who brought her in made exactly the right decision. If Emma had waited even 10 more minutes for an ambulance, we might be having a very different conversation right now." Marcus turned to stare at Sarah, his anger wavering as the doctor's words sank in, and she could see his mind working to reconcile what he had assumed was theft with what appeared to be something entirely different. The police officer who had been waiting patiently stepped forward again and said, "Mr. Wellington, we've reviewed the security footage from your home's camera system, and we can see that Ms. Johnson was carrying your daughter when she took the vehicle, and that the child appeared to be in medical distress." Sarah watched Marcus's face as this information hit him like a physical blow, saw the exact moment when his certainty crumbled and was replaced by something that might have been shame. And she realized that for the first time in 3 years, he was actually seeing her as a person rather than just hired help. The doctor cleared her throat and added, "I also want you to know that your daughter has been asking for Sarah repeatedly since she regained consciousness. She keeps saying that Sarah saved her life, and frankly, from a medical standpoint, that assessment is completely accurate." Marcus sank into the chair next to Sarah, his legs suddenly unable to support him as the full weight of what had happened crashed down on his shoulders. And when he looked at her this time, she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before, gratitude mixed with horrified realization of how wrong he had been. "I thought you were stealing my car," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was so angry that I called the police immediately and demanded their arrest. You for grand theft auto. I never even considered that there might be an emergency." Sarah could see the internal battle playing out across his features as he struggled to reconcile his assumptions with reality. And she said gently, "Emma is the most important thing in that house, Mr. Wellington, and she was dying. Your car is beautiful, but it's just metal and glass. Emma is irreplaceable." The police officer looked between them and said, "Mr. Wellington, given the circumstances and the medical emergency involved, we need to know if you want to proceed with pressing charges, or if you consider this matter resolved." Marcus stared at Sarah for what felt like an eternity, and she could see him wrestling with his pride, his assumptions, and the undeniable fact that his daughter was alive because of the woman he had been ready to send to prison. Finally, he turned to the officer and said, "There will be no charges. Ms. Johnson acted to save my daughter's life, and I was wrong to assume otherwise. I want this matter dropped completely." The relief that washed over Sarah was so intense that tears began streaming down her face. But before she could process her emotions fully, Marcus continued speaking, this time directly to her. "I owe you an apology that I can never fully express," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've treated you like you were invisible for 3 years, never bothering to see you as the remarkable person you clearly are. And when you risked everything to save Emma, my first instinct was to destroy you rather than thank you." Sarah wiped her tears and looked at this powerful man who was humbling himself before her, and she saw something she had never expected to see, genuine remorse and the beginning of respect. "I don't need apologies, Mr. Wellington," she said softly. "I just need to know that Emma is going to be okay, because she's the light of my life, even though she's not my own daughter." Marcus nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes as he began to comprehend the depth of the bond between his daughter and this woman he had taken for granted. And when the doctor returned to tell them that Emma was asking to see both of them, Sarah felt something shift in the universe, as if the invisible walls that had separated their worlds were finally beginning to crumble. As they walked toward Emma's room together, Marcus quietly said, Thank you for saving my daughter's life. Sarah, I will never forget what you did today. And I promise you that things are going to be different from now on. And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah believed that Marcus Wellington was finally seeing her not as the help, but as the hero she had always been. Emma's face lit up like sunrise when Sarah and Marcus walked into her hospital room together, her small hand reaching out immediately toward the woman who had risked everything to save her life. And as Sarah took that tiny hand in hers, she felt the warmth of pure love and gratitude that made all the terror and uncertainty of the past few hours fade into insignificance. "Sarah, you saved me," Emma whispered, her voice still weak but filled with the kind of certainty that only children possess. And when she looked at her father standing awkwardly by the door, she added, "Daddy, Sarah is a hero. She drove your Ferrari super fast to bring me here when I couldn't breathe." Marcus approached the bed slowly, his eyes moving between his daughter and the woman who had become so much more important to Emma than he had ever realized. And for the first time in years, he truly saw the bond that had formed in his absence, the relationship that had flourished while he buried himself in business deals and profit margins. The next morning, news vans lined the street outside the Wellington mansion, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like technological flowers, as reporters competed to tell the story of the maid who stole a Ferrari to save her boss's daughter. A story that had captured the imagination of a city hungry for heroes in an age of cynicism. Marcus stood at his office window overlooking downtown Los Angeles, watching the morning news coverage on 3 different screens. Hearing anchors describe Sarah as everything from a saint to a criminal, and he knew that his next decision would determine not only Sarah's future, but also how the world would remember this extraordinary act of courage. He called his lawyer first, instructing him to prepare a comprehensive legal document that would ensure Sarah never faced any consequences for taking the Ferrari. Then he called his publicist and told her to arrange a press conference for that afternoon, knowing that he needed to control the narrative before others twisted it beyond recognition. But before he could make any public statements, Marcus drove to the small apartment building in East LA, where Sarah lived, a neighborhood he had never visited despite employing her for 3 years. And as he climbed the narrow stairs to her door, he was struck by how different her world was from his own. Sarah answered the door in her worn robe, her eyes red from a sleepless night spent worrying about Emma and her own uncertain future. And she was clearly shocked to see her employer standing in her hallway holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression she had never seen before. "May I come in?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle in a way that Sarah had never heard. And when she nodded and stepped aside, he entered her tiny studio apartment, taking in the second-hand furniture, the photographs of her twin boys on every surface, and the medical bills stacked neatly on a small table. Marcus sat on her threadbare couch and opened the envelope, pulling out several documents as he said, "First, I want you to know that all charges have been permanently dropped, and there will never be any legal consequences for what you did yesterday." Sarah sank into the chair across from him, relief flooding through her like cool water. But Marcus wasn't finished, and what he said next made her wonder if she was dreaming, or if the stress had finally broken her mind completely. "Second, I've been doing some research into your background, and I've learned things that shame me more than I can express," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I know that you send most of your salary to Detroit to support your mother's medical care and your twin boys' education. I know that you work 16-hour days between my house and a night cleaning job, and I know that despite your exhaustion and sacrifice, you've given my daughter more love and attention than her own parents have." Sarah stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing, because this was not the cold, dismissive man who had ignored her for 3 years, but someone entirely different, someone who seemed to actually see her as a human being worthy of respect and consideration. Marcus pulled out another document and said, "I'm offering you a position as Emma's full-time nanny and household manager, with a salary that's 10 times what I currently pay you, full health insurance for you and your family, and a signing bonus that will cover your mother's medical expenses and bring your boys to Los Angeles to live with you." The papers trembled in Sarah's hands as she read the numbers. Amounts that seemed impossible. Life-changing money that would solve every financial worry that had kept her awake at night for years. But even more incredible was the respect and dignity that Marcus was offering along with the position. "Why?" she whispered, looking up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that he had kept buried for too long. "Because yesterday, when I saw you in those handcuffs, I realized that the person I was ready to send to prison was the same person who loves my daughter more than I do, who sees her as a precious individual rather than just another responsibility to manage, he said, wiping his own eyes as years of suppressed guilt came pouring out, because you risked your freedom, your future, everything you had, for a child who isn't even your own, and that kind of love and courage deserves to be rewarded, not punished. Sarah signed the documents with shaking hands, still unable to believe that her life could change so dramatically in the span of 24 hours. That the desperate decision to save Emma had somehow transformed her from invisible help into someone whose value was finally being recognized. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of a beautiful house in a safe neighborhood, watching her twin boys laugh with Emma as they worked on a science project together, their voices filling the space with the kind of joy that had been missing from her life for too long. Marcus had kept every promise, ensuring that her mother received the best medical care in Detroit, that her boys were enrolled in excellent schools, and that Sarah herself was treated not as an employee but as a valued member of their extended family. The red Ferrari sat in the garage, polished and perfect, but now when Sarah saw it, she didn't think about the desperate drive through Los Angeles traffic or the moment when she thought her life was over, but about the courage she had found when it mattered most, the love that had given her strength to risk everything, and the transformation that had come from one impossible choice. Emma, fully recovered and healthier than ever, ran up to Sarah and hugged her tightly, saying, "I'm so glad you're my guardian angel." And as Sarah held the child who had changed everything, she realized that sometimes the most profound transformations come not from grand gestures or careful planning, but from simple acts of love performed when nobody is watching and everything is at stake. Marcus joined them in the kitchen, no longer the cold, distant man she had once known, but someone who had learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or possessions, but in the relationships we build and the love we share. And as they all sat down for dinner together, Sarah knew that she had found something more valuable than money or security. She had found a family who finally saw her not as the invisible woman who cleaned their house, but as the hero who had saved them all.